Thank you everyone so much for joining tonight. My name is Danielle Coe. I am the CEO and founder of Black Women in Clinical Research. The mission of Black Women in Clinical Research is to educate, empower, support, and help Black women thrive in the clinical research industry. This is our week 3 of our Black History Month series. And tonight's theme is Words Have Power. And our special guest that we have is Quincy Byrdsong, who is going to be talking about the history and myths of clinical trials. With everything that's going on in the world right now, and with like COVID-19 and the clinical trials, and knowing that there is a lack of diversity in the amount of clinical trial participants, we feel like a lot of this has to stem from the Tuskegee syphilis study, and also with Henrietta Lacks. So I'm going to have Quincy introduce himself.
All right. Thank you so much, Danielle. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, they can chat and say, let's see what they're saying. Yes.
Okay, great. So Danielle, thank you for having me, and thank you for having this platform for us to talk about this very important topic. A little bit about me, as Danielle mentioned, I will be speaking to you all today about the history and myths of clinical trials. My background is in regulatory compliance, so I got my start in this industry as an IRB director. One of the things that drew me to this field was I happened to be reading the book, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, written by Fred Gray, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But as I was interviewing for this director of IRB position, I happened to be reading that book. So the timing was just perfect, and sort of all the stars aligned for me to take on that role. Currently, I serve as the president of the Society of Clinical Research Associates, also known as SOCRA. I'm also a member of the board of directors for the Association for the Accreditation of Human Research Protection Programs, AHRP. And my day job is I serve as the vice provost for health affairs at Lipscomb University in Nashville, Tennessee. So before we get into my talk, and before I go over sort of what I'm going to cover, Danielle has a few questions so I could get a sense of who my audience is. And so Danielle, if you would like, you could go ahead and put the poll questions up for us.
Quincy, I'm still posting the poll question, so I can just do it while you're speaking, and I can just tell you if that's fine.
Perfect. Right. All right. So this evening we're going to cover, we're going to look at just clinical trials throughout history. Anybody that's heard me talk before, you all know that I'm a history buff. But tonight I'm going to specifically look at some myths and some assumptions that I think people have around clinical trials, human experimentation, and then just hopefully we will sum up this talk with just some lessons learned and how what has happened historically impacts the clinical trial enterprise even today. So let me give you a little bit of history about human subjects research before we get started. I think this foundation is important for you to have. And I don't know how much you all really study this. I'm sort of a nerd when it comes to this kind of thing. So if you all just indulge me just for a few minutes while I give a little bit of background. So human subjects research started, as far as we can tell, around the 10th century. Roman, Greek, Arab medical communities were the places that this happened the most often. 13th century, there was a dialogue between physicians and philosophers regarding whether or not human experimentation should even take place. So the physicians said, well, the best way for us to answer questions about how to treat our patients better would be to use them as the subjects of experiments. The philosophers said, no, the physician's job is to heal, is to not do harm. The physician's job is to not use individuals as data points or as sources of data. At any rate, the philosophers won this discussion, and for many centuries, there was no human subjects research being conducted anywhere. And then the 18th century saw a resurgence of human subjects research, and it started with self-experimentation. So Doctors Priestley and Davy, they administered different doses of surgical anesthesia on themselves to see how they would respond, how long it would take them to be anesthetized. So in essence, they were the investigator and the subject as well. And then Johann Jorg, who was into the pharmaceutical sciences, he ingested some little over a dozen medications to see how his body would respond to it and to look at the properties of these drugs. And then we have the vaccines initially came on the scene in the 18th century as well. Dr. Edward Jenner, Dr. Louis Pasteur, very familiar scientists to all of us. And their research subjects were, in the case of Edward Jenner, he actually tried to save his child's life with an experimental vaccine. Louis Pasteur tried vaccines on people in his community, neighbors, things like that. And so it's a very close knit group of exposure in terms of who would be subjects in these experiments. And then fast forwarded a little bit to the royal family and Princess Caroline in the 1700s. If there was a therapeutic or a vaccine even that had some promise, Princess Caroline said, okay, try this vaccine or this therapy first in the prisons or in the orphans or with infants. If there are no harmful effects to any of them, then after that, we could possibly introduce them to the royal family. It was the notion that prisoners, orphans, and infants were sort of a second tier of human beings. And this is going to be a theme we're going to talk about throughout this evening. And because Princess Caroline looked at these individuals as a second tier of importance, then it was okay for them to be subjected to human experimentation. And so that was what we saw. And then in 1916, the American Medical Association, it was recommended that there be some regulations around conduct of research in human beings. But as a body, they said, well, no, we don't really need regulation because this misconduct is isolated to one or two just really criminal rogue researchers, but it's not the entire research industry itself that needs regulating. So with all that being said, and with this history as the backdrop, let's get into our first myth. Okay, the first myth. Before the Nuremberg Code, there was no expectation for the protection of human research subjects. Is that true or false? Of course, I can't see anybody in the chat room, so Danielle just have to tell me what y'all say. What are people saying, Danielle?
True, false. Looks like mostly false. Got one true, or two trues. Mostly false.
Okay, so most people think that there was no expectation for protection of human research subjects before the Nuremberg Code. So when I hear people talk about, we got a poll, we got our first poll. Let's do our poll first, and then we'll get into this first myth. So how many years have you been in clinical research industry? 1 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years. And if you've been in longer, then you could answer the last one. And we'll give you a few minutes to answer that. And Danielle, for Black History Month, I have on my Benjamin Banneker watch.
Okay.
Black-owned watchmaker, named after the one of our great almanac architect. Benjamin Banneker did a lot of things, so this is named after him. And I wore this in honor of Black History Month, by the way.
All right.
All right. What do we have for the poll?
So our top answer is 5 to 10 years, followed by, there's quite a few people in here that don't have any experience in clinical research. So that is very interesting.
Well, this should be very informative for you all. So good.
Yep, followed by 1 to 3 years and 3 to 5. So most people are very experienced in the clinical research industry.
Great. And so
Oh, sorry. Someone said 0. Sorry, I didn't put over 10 years. I should have. Some people who put 0 is over 10 years.
Actually over 10 years. So we have some veterans. So if there's anything that I say that you want to chime in, we're going to have some time at the end for some discussion. So, okay, good. All right. Do we have any other poll questions? Or is this the only one we have?
Oops, we do.
All right.
Let me see if I can get this. Bear with me, guys. Okay. Relaunch. Okay, we don't want to do that one. I want to do the next one. Ignore this one.
Okay.
It's not going to question number 2. Hold on. Yes. Question number 2. There we go.
All right. So just to get a sense of who we have in the audience, what is your current position in the industry? Study coordinator, you're a monitor, you're a PI, are you someone in the regulatory, or do you have some other position in the industry? We'll give you a little bit of time to answer that.
Quincy, we have almost 100 people in here.
Yeah.
You have brought the people.
No. You brought them, Danielle. I just a small part of this evening, so.
You just show up, huh? Okay, let's see. A lot of people are saying data coordinators, director of clinical operation. Some people, we're even going back to saying how many years they have experience. 28 years in the clinical research industry.
Oh, wow.
25. We have some veterans.
Could have got some of them to teach this class.
Let's see. Yep, clinical trial specialists. That's right. Somebody said patient and patient advocates.
Okay.
Manager of clinical operation.
So we have a pretty wide breadth of represented here. So that's excellent.
I think my father said proud father.
So yeah, so any of this stuff that you all want to take back to your, to your organization, your institution, your hospital, I mean, feel free to do that. I love sharing the information that I've studied and my dissertation was about this. So this is stuff that I love to talk about and I love to share with our industry. Okay. So we got a pretty wide range. So so y'all think that there was an expectation for the protection of human resources before the Nuremberg Code. So that is interesting that you all think that, because what most people say is the Nuremberg Code was the first set of regulations. And as we do a little deeper dive, we've realized that there was something before that. But I'm getting ready to really share something with y'all that's going to kind of blow you away. So just kind of hang on. So those of you said it's false, you were correct. There was actually an expectation for the protection of human resources before the Nuremberg Code. And it was the German Ministry of the Interior. So, okay, so let me kind of back up a little bit. So the first model that we have of academic medicine, the whole concept of doing research and sort of the academic expectation for research, that all started in Europe, and specifically it started in Germany. And because there was so much research going on in Germany, the German Ministry of the Interior did actually develop some guidelines related to human subjects research that predated the Nuremberg Code. And these guidelines, and this is not the entire document, and this entire document is easy to find. You just Google 1931 German Ministry of Interior and you should be able to find it. But the guidelines essentially were that the goal of the research needed to be therapy. So the idea was that these studies would be done, they would fit our current definition of a clinical trial, right? And there would be some sort of intervention with the goal of not just the disease, knowledge about the disease, but according to these guidelines, the individuals that were in the research The goal was actually to provide therapy for the subjects themselves, not just for the disease. Informed consent obtained and documented. So even before Nuremberg, there was an expectation for informed consent to be obtained and documented. And even before the Nuremberg Code, there was a mention about there needed to be protections for vulnerable populations. So this is 1931. This predates Nuremberg. So there was a set of guidelines that predated Nuremberg. So let's move on to the second myth. So the second myth is the Nazi concentration camp experiments were isolated. They were isolated incidents that represented the actions of a depraved regime. So these were individuals that were psychotic, or they were just on some other stuff, and their mind wasn't right. And so these type of experiments were isolated to individuals that were like that. What do y'all think about that? Do you think it was isolated to them?
They are saying false. A lot of no's and false.
Anybody think it was isolated to them? You seen any truths, Danielle?
No truths.
All right, good. It's important that everyone in this audience, regardless of their experience, knows that this was not isolated. And so we're going to talk a little bit about why. So this was not isolated. So let's talk a little bit about the concentration camp experiments, and then we'll talk about what else was going on around the world. So the concentration camp started around 1933, and there were three categories of these experiments. The first category was the survival of the Axis personnel. And so to you history buffs, you know who the Axis personnel was. It was Germany under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, Italy under the leadership of Benito Mussolini. I might mess this up. Japan under the leadership of Tojo. Is that his name? Tojo. And that may be it. Okay, Axis personnel. All the people that were in alliances with the Nazis. And so the experiments were to protect those individuals, either their military or their citizens. So they had experiments like, what is the altitude that's dangerous for a paratrooper? So they would, put them in chambers where they could manipulate the altitude. They also had experiments where they would expose the concentration camp prisoners to freezing temperatures to see how long it would take them to go into hypothermia, because they knew that was one of the things that their military personnel may have to endure. Also, they fed these concentration camp prisoners. They only gave them seawater to drink, to see if they would get enough nutrients from seawater to be able to survive, but also to see if seawater had the potability in order for them to live off of seawater. The next category was drug and treatment trials, sort of analogous to what we would consider a clinical trial, but really, really different. What they would do, they would expose these concentration camp prisoners to disease to test treatments for it. They would expose them to gas to test treatments for it. And then lastly, and probably the one that's most germane to the theme of this series, is essentially what Nazi Germany was about was promote the Aryan race, promote what they called the perfect race, and eliminate everybody that wasn't in it. Right? So the main thrust of the Nazi medical experiments was to advance racial and ideological tenets of the Nazi worldview. They did experiments on twins, where they would take one twin and kill it to see what would happen to the other twin, or they would do something that would make the one twin deform to see what would happen to the other twin. There were serum studies on what they called gypsies, which were inhabitants of sort of the northern Middle Eastern area, northern India, blood serums to try to show that their blood was inferior to the Aryan race's blood. They did the same thing with Jewish people, and they had mass sterilization of anyone that was not in this Aryan race. So what are we really talking about with the Nazi concentration camp experiments? Are we really talking about they didn't know? Do we think that they didn't know any better? Or do we just think that they were unethical? Was this a question of ethics, or was this a question of knowledge? because these concentration camps happened when the German Ministry of Interior guidelines were already in place. Now, obviously, this predated the Nuremberg Code, but was this about they just didn't know any better? Was this innocent? Were these individuals innocent? Did they just not know that this was bad? Well, let's talk about that. So,
saying not innocent, purely unethical, lack of ethics, both. No, it was about power,
power,
ethics, lack of ethics.
Okay, so it seems like we're all in agreement. So Aristotle, who is the person I call the father of ethics, I guess if there is a father of ethics, Aristotle, he wrote a lot about ethics in his day, and he really brought out a point that I think is really can really be applied to what was going on in Nazi Germany. The difference between goodness of intellect and goodness of character, right? They're both admirable and praiseworthy, but one, the goodness of intellect is about what you know. Goodness of character is about what you do. Goodness of intellect comes from what you study, but the goodness of character comes from what you're disciplined to do. And this really applies to what was going on in Nazi concentration camp experiments, because the results of these experiments were actually used to help the Axis personnel. So the results of the experiments were actually used, and there's still things that we use today, based on some of the results of these experiments. But in terms of ethical, compass, moral compass, it had none. So the doctor's trial. Another way you can look at this is the permissible medical experiments. Also, it's the United States of America versus Carl Brandt. And I used to think when I first studied this that Carl Brandt was like the ringleader, but he wasn't the ringleader. It was just an alphabetical order, and his name ends with the letter B, so that's why his name was first. So, but he was just one of many doctors that were put on trial. 23 defendants, 16 were found guilty, and they weren't found guilty of unethical research, right? They were found guilty of murder. They were found guilty of war crimes, namely murder. Part of the verdict of this trial was the Nuremberg Code. So now you have regulation that was created. Now, what's interesting in the first bullet is it says the United States of America versus Carl Brandt. So it was the United States of America that tried these Nazi doctors. Why am I bringing that up? Just hold tight on why that's sort of ironic that it's the United States that's doing this. It's the United States that's saying that this is bad. That's going to be very ironic in a second. So it established the requirements for informed consent, absence of coercion, research design, and beneficence. So it established the requirements that would be universally applicable, whereas the German Ministry of the Interior was really to just the German medical community. But then there was this guy named Andrew Ivy, who represented the American Medical Association at the doctor's trial. So Andrew Ivy, he was one of the people that was really, really hard on the Nazis for what they were doing. But Dr. Ivy goes back to the States, and he writes a set of ethical guidelines on behalf of the American Medical Association, goes back to the trial and tries to convince them that the Americans had these guidelines all along. When in actuality, we found out that he wrote these guidelines during the trial to make the Nazis think that the U.S. had already had guidelines for ethical research, and in actuality, they didn't. And Dr. Ivy was also credited for writing the Nuremberg Code, but as we look at revisionist history, it turns out that he may not have actually written it. So why is it ironic that the United States was looking at this, and why is this a myth? Well, during this same time, let's look at what's going on in the United States. At the same time, look at what's going on in the United States. Office of the Scientific Research Development. They took people that were conscientious objectors to the draft and look at the experiments that they did on them. Altitude, exposure to gas, temperature extremes, water potability. Wow. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? These are the same types of experiments that we indicted the Nazis for. So this concept of this was restricted to the Nazis. Not only was it not restricted just to the Nazis, but we as a country were actually guilty of the exact same thing. While we were, bad Nazis, they're depraved, they're crazy, they're this. While all that's going on, we are doing that to our own citizens right here in this country. Manhattan Project, around the same time and a little after, injected humans with radiation, plutonium, polonium, uranium, all these things. This was going on right here in the United States before and after the doctor's trial. University of Chicago and the U.S. Army, they conducted the malaria project between 1944 and 1946, the malaria project, where individuals were prisoners and mentally ill patients were injected with malaria. This was going on in 44 and 46, right here in the United States. The Fernand Center, children with developmental disabilities, they were taken out into what they call the science club. They were the science club. And in the science club, they would put in their milk of these kids, they would inject with radioactive iron and calcium. These were kids that the United States was doing this to. So to say that this type of activity was isolated to the Nazis is really sort of hypocritical for us to even say, because during that same time, we in the United States was actually doing the exact same thing that we said the Nazis were guilty of. All right. Any comments about that? I bet if I could hear you all, I could hear a pin drop right now.
Well, we have some people who have their hand raised. Did you want?
Oh my gosh. We can take one or two comments.
Okay. All right. I got two people already that raised their hands. So,
all right, let's hear it.
Oh, it's three. Let's see. Zach Mitchell.
Good to hear from you, Zach. We'd love to hear your comment.
He's not responding. Let's go to the next.
All right. Let's hear
Erica.
Erica, how are you, my sister?
Hey, how are you, friend?
Great.
So one other one that I was thinking about that might be worth commenting on, because it didn't come out until, I'm going to say it was maybe early 2000s, was the hidden studies on the Guatemala prison studies, the sex STD trials that came out. ORI exposed it many years later because it was taking place, I believe, in the 60s. Don't quote me on the date, sir, but yes.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, Erica, because we're going to actually talk about that study here in a little bit. But yeah, definitely.
Didn't mean to steal the thunder.
No, you didn't at all. And in fact, we're going to see that the timing of that was right around this same time too. So yeah. Thank you, Erica, for bringing that up.
And hi, Erica.
Hi, Danielle. Nice to hear you.
Okay, we have.
So for those of you all that don't know, I'm president of SOCRA. Erica is in the similar position with ACRP, the Association of Clinical Research Professionals. So Erica is a very, very dear colleague and very knowledgeable of the industry as well. Who else we have?
We have Perla.
Perla, love to hear your comment, Perla.
Hi, yeah. So I didn't realize all these that there were all these situations and things happening in the United States. So thank you for bringing that awareness to all of us. And to me, it's evil. Yeah. I mean, there's only one way to say it. It's pure evil. So. Yeah,
Perla.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for your comment. It's rough. Some of the history, and it's sobering, but we need to know in order for us to not make some of those same mistakes. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the third myth we're going to go to, Danielle, is Dr. Beecher, Henry Beecher. He wrote the article, Ethics in Clinical Research, to encourage the clinical research industry to increase regulation and oversight. What do y'all think about that? And I'm sure that everybody here has read the Beecher article or the Beecher expose, whatever you want to call it. So y'all think that he wrote it to So there would be more regulation?
Let's see. Someone said, no, that was not the intent. A lot of people are saying no. False.
Okay, great. So the Beecher article, so let's talk a little bit about the Beecher article before we answer whether or not this is a myth. So the Beecher article was written by Henry Beecher, who was actually a World War II physician. I want to say that his specialty was anesthesiology. And he was, Ivy League trained. He worked in Ivy League institutions. Was a very, very reputable physician. But he served in North Africa and Italy, and he actually, was a student of the Nazi concentration camp experiments. So in the 50s and 60s, he sort of pioneered this whole thing about, this concept of research ethics. And what Dr. Beecher said, what happened in Nazi Germany is not unique to Nazi Germany, that there may be some unethical research going on right here in the United States, kind of what we talked about a second ago. And so he wrote the article, Ethics in Clinical Research in the New England Journal of Medicine in June of 1966. And anybody on this call that hasn't read this article, I mean, you need to read it. It's a must read in this industry. It is probably the most important article ever written in our industry. And it kind of sets the tone for everything that we do. But let's talk a little bit about what was in this article. So placebo-controlled studies of strep throat, when there was therapy that was available for strep throat, there were researchers that, even though there was therapy for strep throat, they withheld treatment. Relapse rate of typhoid fever was another study that the Beecher article exposed, where people with typhoid fever, they wouldn't treat it just to see how long it would take for it to do harm. Cyclopropane anesthesia and arrhythmias. There was an investigator that exposed people to anesthesia to initiate these life-threatening arrhythmias just to see how much anesthesia it took for someone to have a heart attack. I mean, these are the kinds of studies that were going on in the United States that Dr. Beecher wanted to bring out. And the study of untreated hepatitis in Willowbrook, which is a very familiar study for us as well, where mentally ill young people were injected with hepatitis, and they were told that the conditions were so unsanitary that they were going to catch hepatitis anyway. These were studies that Dr. Beecher pointed out in his article. So some of the themes, right? Urgence, these are questions that had to be answered urgently. Consent was a big theme, that there wasn't any consent in any of these studies. Coercion, withholding information, withholding treatment, just exposing subjects to risk unnecessarily was part of this. And then exposing them to risks that were excessive when you compare them to what the potential benefits were. And then just all the issues regarding informed consent. So if Dr. Beecher's intent was not, if it was not to create more regulation, then what was he trying to accomplish? So let's talk a little bit about what was going on with this article, because these are some interesting facts about him and about this article. So Dr. Beecher wrote this article. A lot of the reason why he wrote this article, because he felt guilty about a study that he himself conducted, where informed consent was not appropriately obtained. So a lot of the impetus behind him writing this article was personal guilt that he may not have been ethical as a researcher. And I found that very, very interesting. You couple that with the fact that he was actually involved in some way with the concentration camp prisoners. It was almost like Dr. Beecher was purging when he wrote this article. And that he wanted to make sure that his thinking or lack of conscientious approaches to research, he wanted to make sure that this was not ubiquitous, and this was something that the industry would always be reeling from. Also, the original article was a summary of 50 studies, and it was rejected by JAMA. JAMA would not touch it. They were like, there's no way we were going to publish an article that exposes unethical research done in the United States. JAMA wouldn't touch it. Wow, wouldn't touch it. And then the New England Journal of Medicine decided that they would touch it only after their editor overruled the board's rejection of it. So the New England Journal of Medicine wasn't going to touch it either. Do you see sort of this whole, I don't know, agreement that unethical research in America should not have been exposed? There was sort of agreement, even by the scientific journals. But the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine was a co-author of this article, and he overruled the editorial board. And, this is one of those examples of, just, I don't know, conflict of interest, whatever word you want to use. But they circumvented the rules. But in this case, I guess it kind of worked, because we would have never had this article had this not been able to be published. So what was his intent? Beecher said, look what he said in the article. This is a quote from his article. "There is the more reliable safeguard provided by the presence of an intelligent, informed, conscientious, compassionate, responsible investigator." Dr. Beecher said the investigator can protect them. But what a novel concept. He said if the investigator is intelligent, conscientious, compassionate, responsible, the investigator can do all of the regulating of this research that needs to happen. And, a part of me agrees with that. That's where it starts, with the investigator. We can put all the regulations out there in the world. If the investigator and the research team does not feel it's important to be ethical, then we haven't really accomplished anything. He said the researchers weren't malicious or evil, rather thoughtless or careless. I would agree to that to a certain degree. I don't think every researcher is malicious or evil, but some of the things that we're going to talk about sounded very malicious and very evil. He said self-scrutiny, not public review, was the answer. People need to check themselves, is what he said. And he said the profession doesn't need any more regulation. He said the profession needs better mechanisms for self-regulation. He was trying to really rock the industry of sort of this moral complacency or moral apathy around ethics and clinical research. So that was what Beecher's intent was. And unfortunately, this is what happened after the Beecher article. Beecher said, we don't need more regulation. And what happened after the Beecher article? A whole bunch of regulations. So it really went against his original intent, which was more self-regulation, more mechanisms for people to deal with their own ethical dilemmas in a responsible way. Any comments before we go to our next myth? All right, so our next myth. The study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male in Macon County, Alabama, was the only public health service funded research study which focused on a single race of people. True, false? What we got, Danielle?
A lot of people are saying false. False. We're getting a lot of false. Someone said true, just a guess.
Okay. So clearly this was the most, I guess the most known study. So this study I'm talking about is what is commonly called the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. But the actual name of the study is the study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. I prefer to call it this as opposed to the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. And the reason why is because I don't want anybody to think that Tuskegee was behind this study, because they weren't. They didn't support the study at all. Tuskegee was actually the victim of the study. And so I call it the Public Health Service study on untreated syphilis in the Negro male, because I want the blame to be put on who actually was behind this study. So whenever you ever hear me talk, you'll hardly ever hear me refer to it as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. You'll always see me refer to it as this. Tuskegee wasn't behind this. They didn't support this. They didn't fund it. They didn't do any of that. They were the victims of the public health service in this situation. This is a quote from one of the scientists in the study of untreated syphilis in Negro male. Dr. Thompson Quote was one of the scientists, one of the researchers. He said, the future of the Negro lies more in the research laboratory than in the schools. Wow. He said, we shouldn't be trying to educate Black people. let's just use them as lab rats. This was a scientist saying this. This was a researcher saying this. And when you look at everything that happened during the study, I just pulled out one quote. I mean, I could have pulled out many. And Perla mentioned sort of the evil that's behind a lot of this stuff. There were some quotes that were a lot more inflammatory than this one that I could have used. They were very, very graphic in reference to Black people. So I'll pull sort of a one that was not so, I don't know, egregiously racist, but this is racist enough as far as I'm concerned. Future of the Negro is in the laboratory, not in the schools. And what I have shown up here for y'all to look, and this is one of the consent forms that they signed, and it's a stretch to call it a consent form. It actually says that they're being treated. It has things in capital letters like, this is your last chance for special treatment. It says special treatment many times. It says free treatment many times. All these things to try to get these individuals to be a part of this. A very, very an exploitative document. And this is actually, part of the annals of what happened in Macon County, Alabama. So this is a quick timeline of what happened for all of you all that don't know. It started out as a treatment study. So in Macon County, Alabama, we had somewhere in the ballpark of 36% of the population was syphilitic. So kind of put that in perspective. Out of every 10 people you saw in Macon County, 4 of them had syphilis. So this was not a insignificant disease in this community. And so philanthropist Rosenwald decided to treat these individuals as a responsible response to an epidemic. But he ran out of money, and the physicians decided to continue to follow these individuals untreated. So they essentially lied to them. They convinced them that they were there to treat them, but in actuality, they were there to follow them untreated. They got the Public Health Service to fund this study because they felt that this was an opportunity for them to learn more about syphilis, and they thought this would be a good racial comparator, responses to syphilis than Black males. So they gave all these scientific reasons. The Public Health Service supported it, but in 1947 was when it got even more unethical than it already was. 1947, penicillin was discovered and was discovered in 45, but it was being used in 47 to treat the military populations. They could have easily stopped this study, treated these individuals, and cured them of syphilis, but they continued this study for another 30 years. And I actually was in conversation with Fred Gray, who represented the subjects in this study. Just last week, we had a really long, in-depth conversation about this. And it was a very, very embarrassing episode, very just egregiously unethical episode in the history of this country. But was this the only Public Health Service funded study? Well, Erica actually mentioned the other one. There was another Public Health Service study going on during this same time in Guatemala. 5,000 people, children, orphans, prostitutes, patients, prisoners, soldiers. These were not people that already had STDs like the syphilis study. These were people that they injected with STDs. And here's the type of language that they use to describe the Guatemalans. The researchers said things like, well, they're savages. They give each other STDs all the time. So we can go ahead and inject them with it. They're going to catch it anyway. One individual, they injected her with gonorrhea, and she started having they injected her with syphilis. She had all these really, really bad side effects. And they said, while we're at it, let's go ahead and inject her with gonorrhea as well, to see how multiple STDs would interact in an individual. So this is what they did under the name of science. And the Public Health Service, the federal government, actually funded that study in Guatemala. All right, comments.
Everyone is saying it's awful. Let's see, disgusting. someone asked, do you believe the consent form was intended for consent, or was it intended for an advertisement or fear tactic? Did the researchers actually believe they needed consent if they did not view them as humans, per your quote? They may have said it was consent, but there is no way they thought that is what that is.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So they didn't think it was consent. They used that document to convince them to participate. And so you notice the things that were in that document, things like free treatment, free room and board, free this, special treatment, last chance. They had all of these really, these buzzwords that they knew this population would respond to. Free, all through the document. Special. They were trying to make this population think that they were being given something special. They were trying to make this population that had been disenfranchised. They were trying to make this population feel important, because the more important that they made this population feel, the more likely they were to participate and the more susceptible they would be to their deception.
I have another comment. Someone's said, sad to say, but outcomes from many of these unethical trials are still contributors to healthcare knowledge and play a huge part on how we treat patients today. Yeah,
and a prime example is the hepatitis study that I mentioned that the Beecher article brought out. So the hepatitis study, to that individual's point that made that comment, the hepatitis study that was done on mentally retarded children is the study that gave us multiple strains of hepatitis. That's how we found out that there was a hepatitis A and B. It was that study. So you think about the most important study ever done in hepatitis. It gives us all the information we have about hepatitis. That was actually done in a very, very egregiously unethical way. So yeah, that comment that individual made is sort of maybe the saddest commentary of all of this.
Yeah. Someone asked, do you know if the people in the trials knew how to read?
So the people in this trial, the syphilis study, the majority of them were sharecroppers, because this was all men. So they were educated, but not in the formal sense. So they were educated in trades and agricultural ways. Literacy was spotty. There may have been some people that could read well, but then there may have been some that had very, very low literacy. And you have to think of where we are, right? And that study was in Macon County, Alabama, which is not just the South, it's the deep South. And it was in a county that was, of the 27,000 people that lived in Macon County, 22,000 of them were Black. So if you think about the resources that were in that county, the education system that was in that county, yeah, it's a strong possibility that the literacy levels were probably very low. So on to our next myth. Historically, the military has been given protections for in these studies. So y'all think that's true? The military?
No, true.
So we have some people that think that the military has been given additional protections.
Yes, false, true. False, true. True, false. Someone said, I'm going to guess false because they don't truly care about them.
Okay. All right. So the U.S. military, unfortunately, and we're all on this call in this industry. Unfortunately, the military had been exploited at the same level, and in some cases more so than some of these other populations. Because military are not considered civilians, they technically don't have rights as U.S. citizens. They had to do what the military tells them to do. So that has been exploited historically. So just a couple of examples during the Cold War. So we're talking about Korea, Vietnam. There was the Project MK Ultra, where they did experiments on the military populations and U.S. prisoners of war, where they exposed them to psychedelic drugs, paralytics, electroshock therapy. Most of the subjects didn't know they were in studies, had no idea that these drugs would impair their physical and mental function. But it was a U.S. government funded thing. Again, this seems to be an unfortunate pattern. The government was behind it, and this went on from 1950 to 1974, and we're talking about over 150 discrete, separate research studies to do this. And so they had this whole sort of program that the U.S. government funded because they thought that U.S. thought that their enemies would try to attack their military with psychedelic drugs. LSD, they thought they would try to get us with. So what they did was our CIA conducted studies in our military personnel, giving them LSD without them knowing it. We did this to our military. And then Operation Midnight Climax was a situation where the government actually had prostitutes on their payroll. Operation Midnight Climax, they had prostitutes on their payroll. The prostitutes would get with the military personnel that would be on leave, and the prostitutes were given LSD to slip into the military personnel's drinks. And then the government would follow these military personnel to see how this LSD would impact their behavior. Government-funded study. One specific example was the Private James Thornwell. He was the only Black soldier that was stationed in this military base in France. And they made up this story that he had been stealing classified communication, and that he was selling them to people that were enemies of the United States. And they interrogated him, physically tortured him, called him the N-word. They pricked his body, and it turned out that all these body pricks had LSD in them. And they made up this entire story about him being a spy, even though there was no evidence to support this. They essentially singled him out because he was Black. And this LSD caused him to have antisocial behavior, psychiatric disorders. He sued the federal government and got a very unremarkable lawsuit of $625,000. And he ended up being found dead in his pool some 4 years later. And the autopsy showed that his mental faculties are severely damaged. So this is just an example. I mean, he wasn't protected by being in the military. He was still not looked at as important because he was Black, and he still suffered this very, very unethical treatment in the name of research. All right, I'm gonna take a breath now before I get to my last myth. We're almost done, y'all. So our last myth: only certain categories of individuals are vulnerable research subjects in clinical trials. So only certain categories. What do y'all think?
False. False, truly false.
Okay. Let's talk about vulnerability for our last few minutes, and then we'll open it up for any more discussion. So I show this slide every time I talk about vulnerability. So if you could just walk with me through it. So we look at her and say, yeah, vulnerable, right? She's pregnant, but there may be other reasons why she's vulnerable. She's a woman. There are certain vulnerabilities being associated with being a female. There may be a vulnerability. She looks as if she's Latino. So there may be some vulnerability in the fact that she may not be English speaking. So look at this picture. There's the obvious vulnerability that she's pregnant, but there may be other vulnerabilities as well. And then prisoners, we kept giving those as examples of people vulnerable. They're vulnerable because they are already conditioned to just respond to authority. In fact, they are conditioned to respond to authority almost without even thinking about it. And then we have a child here. So they're vulnerable because they're a child, but you look closer, the child there's tears in the child's eyes. We don't know what their financial situation is. There may be vulnerability there. There may be a resource vulnerability. We don't know. But just looking at this picture, you can't tell all the vulnerabilities. And then you have her, big smile on her face. You look at her and say, she's not vulnerable, is she? Well, I don't know. She might be vulnerable. This demographic, when I lived in Atlanta, Georgia, was the highest demographic of depression. It was also the highest demographic of new HIV cases. So you look at that smiling face and you say, oh, this person's not vulnerable. And then we have, this person can't possibly be vulnerable, right? He's the reason why everything bad in this country happens. And we assume that he has resources. We assume that he's educated. We assume that he does not have a care in the world. And that's why he's vulnerable. Because we don't look at him as possibly being vulnerable. That actually makes him vulnerable. We have this lady here. Don't know what the vulnerability is there. Another man here. We don't know what the vulnerability is. Well, what's the point of this slide? The point of this slide is anybody could be vulnerable. And so let's do a quick definition of vulnerability, and then let's talk about why anybody could be vulnerable. So vulnerability just talks about being wounded. Levine said that some people are more likely than others to be mistreated. The Presidential Commission said that certain individuals are unable to protect their own interest. And so what you have is you have an irresponsible researcher and you combine it with a vulnerable subject, and then that's when we have the incidence of unethical research. So we have to redefine vulnerability, and that's why that's a myth that says the categories, because one approach to vulnerability is that it's categorical, meaning certain populations that share characteristics of vulnerable, but actually vulnerability is contextual, meaning anybody given a given situation could be vulnerable. So there's 6 types of vulnerability. There's that cognitive vulnerability, their ability to understand. There's juridical vulnerability, that responding to authority. There's deferential vulnerability, you being used to obey clinicians because they're clinicians. Medical vulnerability, you have a disease that's terminal, you may be more vulnerable to mistreatment. Allocational vulnerability, if you don't have access to resources or education, that makes you vulnerable. And then lastly, there's the infrastructure vulnerabilities. There may be limits in the research setting that make anybody in that setting vulnerable. So with all these myths, all this talk of coercion, undue influence, deception, harm, all this, and all of these myths, all of this history. So all we need to do, right, is revise the common rule and add some more regulation, right? And then we're good.
No.
Yeah, that's the easy answer, but I think that by the end of this talk, you understand that that's not it. It's never been the issue. We didn't have enough regulation. We got enough regulations we don't need to have one more regulation written, right? We got plenty of regulation, and we can revise the common rule until the cows come home. It's not going to matter. What needs to happen is this, and I hope you take away these concepts. Aristotle again, he said, with regard to excellence, it's not enough to know. It's not enough to know. We must try to have and use it. So it's not about knowing what to do. It's about doing what we're supposed to do. And Aristotle said about philosophy, I do this stuff without being commanded, what others do out of fear of the law. We shouldn't treat these subjects right because the regulations say we should. We should protect these individuals in clinical trials because it's the right thing to do, even if we didn't have any regulation. We do what we're supposed to do to honor life, to honor human dignity. We're celebrating Black History Month, and it's a celebration of everything that we've accomplished. But at the same time, we still have a long way to go in terms of being treated, actually fairly and equitably. So what are the take homes? Regulations are cool, right? But they're the floor. They're not the ceiling. There's no substitute for us to have good judgment. And we got to practice good judgment every single time. We need to use ethical decision making to complement the policies and procedures, right? So there are going to be situations where there's not a regulation that really describes what it is that we're encountering. So at those instances, we have to know what to do. We have to have an ethical decision-making model that we follow. And then use the team approach. Hey, if Danielle is in a situation where she doesn't really know what she thinks should be the right thing, that's when she calls up her good friend Quincy Byrdsong and says, hey, Q, I got this situation. What do you think? And then I would do the same for her if I run into a situation where I need to bounce something off, or my good friend Erica at ACRP. Use a team approach. It's okay to bounce stuff off of each other, and then focus on outcomes that consider everybody. Quit doing this thing about some people are important and some people aren't. All the stakeholders, from the research subject to the community to the physician to everybody that's involved, to the coordinator. All the stakeholders we need to consider, and then just continue to educate, right? Monitor what we do and then educate some more. We have to understand that anyone could potentially be in harm's way as a research subject. The context is a lot more important than the category. And we have to make sure that everyone is treated with the utmost information, independence, and importance. Because if they lack any of those three things, then they can be a vulnerable research subject. And respect for persons is more than just getting a consent form signed. It's about trust, it's about compassion, it's about communication. And the good of science should never be considered over the importance of human life. And ethics, compliance, they're not enemies of each other, right? You can be ethical and you can be compliant. But you don't have to be ethical at the expense of compliance, and you definitely don't want to be compliant at the expense of being ethical. So that's it. That's my talk, and that's history. That's the myths. That's the take homes. That's the lessons learned. That is my time with you. Discussion, comments, questions. What do you think?
Wow. I'm speechless. Whoa. There's a lot of things I did not know. And I'm sure everyone is talking about they're blown away. Yes, if anyone would want to say anything, please raise your hand. I can have you speak, or I know while we're waiting for people to raise their hand, we do have a question. Didn't Tuskegee receive funding for the study? That's what one person asked.
Didn't the Tuskegee Institute?
She just said Tuskegee, yes, received funding for the study.
So the Public Health Service gave funding to the researchers. And the researchers, many of them resided in Tuskegee, Alabama, either before the study or during the study. The Tuskegee Institute was one of the facilities where some of the subjects were seen. And so to the extent that they were given some facility support, they did receive that. And you got to understand, and that's a good question, because there was a nurse that was a very important part of this study, and they actually did a movie about her called Mrs. Evers Boys. And Ms. Evers Boys, and it's actually on HBO Max right now, if anybody wants to watch it. But anyway, this nurse was an important part of this whole equation, because the nurse, Eunice Rivers, was actually a community health nurse that was a very trusted member of that community. She became essentially the study coordinator. And that was very strategic on behalf of the research team to have someone in the study that they knew that the subjects would trust. She was a graduate of Tuskegee Institute School of Nursing, so that kind of added to it as well. And so they were able to really convince her, and they were able to convince people associated with the Institute that this was good for them, that down the line, this would open up opportunities for the government to give them more money, which the government didn't do. That was a lie too. So there was a lot going on that made it a very sort of colluded effort.
Okay, so Crystal, would you like to say something?
Yes. First and foremost, I want to thank you and Danielle for you know, talking about this, bringing this presentation to the group. I really learned a lot about it. I'm fairly new in the clinical research industry. It's been about, I would say about 4 years. So this
Okay.
really opened my eyes about a lot of things. My question is, with all that we just talked about, the history of trials and the evils of those trials, how do we get people, especially people within the African American community, to participate and trust trials with the given history?
Yeah, excellent question, Crystal. So glad you asked me that. I mentioned earlier that I had a conversation with Fred Gray, who represented the subjects in this. And he said something to me that was just so powerful. He said, Quincy, the syphilis study has done so much damage to the Black community. He said, I hate that it is continuing to do damage because it has now made the Black community not trust research. He said that is sort of, to him, the worst of all of this, because it did enough damage already, but now it's continuing to do damage because now we don't trust the establishment enough to participate in research. So how do we get them to trust? The first thing we do, Crystal, is acknowledge that they have a legitimate reason not to trust us. Out the gate. We need to quit doing this stuff where we say, well, I don't know why they don't trust us. I don't know why they don't trust us. I don't know why. We need to quit saying that. We know exactly why they don't trust us. And we need to own that. We need to say, you know what, Black community, you don't trust us and you have every reason not to. But then we have to redirect that energy, right? And we have to do a lot more education of what their lack of participation is actually doing to how we develop drugs and how we get devices approved. So what I say when I educate in the Black community, I say, yeah, I agree that you shouldn't trust us, but by you not participating in these trials, there are drugs and therapies that are being approved that have never been tested on us. We don't know how they work in us. And by us allowing our mistrust to reduce our likelihood to participate, we're actually removing our seat from the table. We're actually removing our voice from the conversation. That's the part that the Black community is not hearing. They're thinking that they're making a stand. We don't trust it because of what's going on in history. So part of my stand is I'm not going to participate in the trial. They think that they're getting back at the research community by not participating, but in actuality, we have to help them understand that they're actually removing their seat from the table and their voice from the conversation. So I think that our education of the Black community, Crystal, has to be a lot more comprehensive, explaining to them what it is that their participation in the research actually represents. I hope I answered your question.
You did. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm gonna say, I think I saw my mother raise her hand.
Okay.
Mom?
Yeah, well, Crystal did say some what I wanted to say, so she did get a lot of that. But I wanted to also say I understand what you're saying about we should trust, but this goes all the way back, to slavery. So this distrust is not just now in the last within the 19 and the 18. It's further back to that. Goes all the way back to when we first come over here. So now you're saying that I understand that you shouldn't trust us, but this is what you need. There's got to be another way of us trusting you all to do this because, you're not looking like us. That's another reason I think, my daughter started this. We don't have people that look like us. We're the guinea pigs. You see on TV, even with the COVID, you see the Black people are the ones that's getting it to show us, oh, wow, look, they're getting it. But that we know that stage, and then how long should we wait for a trial? I mean, is there a certain amount of time? Because I don't think this COVID has been studied enough for us to be giving it to us. So should we be fearful that they just automatically put it out here, since we're talking about, you know, how long it's been out? And is it 10 years? I mean, I understand the need for it because people are dying, but we still got to look at the fact that it has not had enough trial study, right?
So you said a lot. So
Yes, because I have a lot to deal with this COVID because everybody around me is taking it.
That's Mama Coe.
So there were a bunch of questions in there. So Danielle, I'll just try to respond where I'm answering all the questions to the best that I can remember. So I'm not saying that the Black community should trust. I'm not saying that they should trust. So that's the first thing. I'm not saying that. And you'll never hear me say that. I mean, why do you think I talk about this all the time? I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is when our lack of trust translates into us not participating, that's a problem. It's a problem because we are putting drugs on the market that have been tested in the majority of the people it's being tested in is 50-something-year-old white males. And because we're not participating, and we're saying we don't trust the establishment, so we're not going to participate. So a drug that we might need to take has never been tested on us. It may be harmful to us. We wouldn't know because we're not participating in the trials. So we're not giving ourselves the opportunity for them to collect data on people that look like us. That's a big problem. So and so I'm not saying that we should trust, but I'm also saying that when our lack of trust translates into us not participating, we are actually doing ourselves a huge, huge disservice. So
sorry. Oh, I didn't want to cut you off. I was trying to find my father, but it doesn't look like he's in the chat anymore because yes, he is. Hold on.
Okay.
Dad, can you just talk about what the ACE inhibitors did to you?
Oh,
Papa Coe?
I'm talking.
All right, go ahead.
Oh, once I got to the point in my life where I had high blood pressure, my doctor gave me a prescription for, can I say the word correctly? Liposinapryl, AC inhibitor. And one day I was sleeping on my on the floor, and I got up and I got to work, and my lip like doubled, tripled in size. And so I went to the hospital, and they told me that I was allergic to this particular medicine. Well, after recovering, I guess about 3 years later, my doctor gave it to me again, and partly it was my fault too because I forgot. And he gave it to me again, and the same thing happened again. Mm-hmm. So I told him, I said, "You didn't write this down the last time I had this issue." So
you sound far away, Dad.
I'm right here. I don't think there's on this particular drug. There's been a great amount of testing done for on Black people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us, because that's, what you said is an example of exactly what I'm talking about. We're taking drugs to heal our bodies when they've never been tested on anybody that looks like us.
Right.
And then we wonder why we don't respond to the drug. We wonder why, in some cases, like the case of your dad, it may actually harm us. Not only will it not help us, but in some cases, some of these drugs actually will harm us. And we've seen, and this is a common example. We've seen this happen over and over and over again when they introduce a drug that was only tested in white males. They introduce them to the Black community, and then there's all these crazy side effects, there's all this harm. And it's because we are not participating in the trial so they can have data. Because what happens is if you have representation in the trial, you have data on how it affected men, how it affected people of a certain age, how it affected gender, how it affected different races. And what you have is you have a data safety monitoring committee, or you have a group of individuals that's analyzing those trends across the multiple sites. They may find things that are significant in terms of how a certain race or a certain gender or a certain age group responds. And then that could actually help when the new drug approval, when the NDA is finalized. All this kind of stuff could be part of, the brochure for the drug, and it gives us a lot more information about how it shows up in these different populations. But if everybody on the trial is the same, then it generalizes to the majority, which has been the problem with our race for 400, 500 years. All this stuff is generalized to the majority, right? What's in the Constitution, right? All men are created equal. All men, was that talking about me? No, I don't think so. When I used to say the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God, was that talking about me? You see what I'm saying? So when we don't participate in these trials, we're actually helping this generalization to the majority, which we just can't allow. I'm sorry, I got my soapbox, Nancy.
Oh, no, you're fine. Hazel?
Hi, I want to say thank you so much for giving your talk, and also to Danielle for hosting this format with BWICR. I co-sign everything that you said in regards to taking medications that do not work for you. Like, even myself taking some acne medication, open up the inlet and seeing what the N number size for how many Black people participate in. I'm like, no wonder these things are not working. But my question that I'm asking to you in regards to Black people and their participation in clinical trials, what do you say or think of global pharmaceutical industries that don't just recruit within the United States, but they recruit outside, and how they also treat folks of the Black diaspora? What do you have to also say about that? Do you feel that they too are even more vulnerable, being that maybe the level of intervention and regulation may not be as high as in the United States?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that depending, on what part of the globe we're talking about, I think that they're very vulnerable. Because of the regulatory structures that are in place, like you mentioned, are not as rigorous. And then just the understanding of the pharmaceutical industry is not, the level of awareness is just not as high in those places. And so I don't think the pharmaceutical companies are going the extra mile to make sure that these communities are being educated to the level that they need to be. And then also, this is not a jab at pharmaceutical companies, but pharmaceutical companies have to do their part in accountability. If they're picking sites to conduct these studies, I mean, they have to hold these sites accountable for what they do. And you're a pharma company, you come to my site and you say, I want you to get 100. I want you to get 100 subjects at your site, and I give you 100 subjects that all look the same. As a pharmaceutical company, you should say, no, that's unacceptable. But that's not what's happening. They're like, well, you got the subjects we needed, so we'll keep it moving. But at the same time, going to other parts of the globe, they're vulnerable because of the lack of understanding of the pharmaceutical industry, the lack of controls that are in place. But then I guess the greatest mistreatment or inequitable situation with these areas is some of these therapies are studied in areas that would never be able to afford the therapy once it's approved. So it's like it's okay for them to be experimented on, but they'll never actually benefit from the approved drug. And that's really unfortunate. We saw that a lot with a lot of the malaria studies.
Yeah.
So
I also noticed that, like,
100%. Yeah.
Sorry. I also noticed that like last year around when they started uh, having all these researchers come out in a race to find and test out on COVID, there was these two French, I don't know if you recall hearing that these two French researchers got on their national TV and saying that they wanted to test out an experiment in African countries where they actually had lower transmission rate at the time of COVID, whereas hotspots were popping up in the UK, in Seattle, Washington, and their thought wasn't even to test in what you would call the West more so. Their thought was to go straight to test out in these countries. And so like when I thought about that, I was just like, these are people who are still getting grant money to do research or to lead these organizations and to exploit people. And so I wonder like, where is the accountability at that level?
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's not any. I mean, it's sort of the mentality. I'm not. No, they have a right to go into those places and do whatever they want to do. And unfortunately, there's no accountability there. And but I think it's we in this industry have an opportunity to we have a better opportunity than we realize to hold pharma companies accountable. We have opportunities to hold governments accountable because we're on the front lines of this industry. We're doing the work and we see the impact that it's having on these populations. So yeah, it's what you're describing is very, very unfortunate.
All right, Nadine.
Yes, thank you. So I just wanted to say thank you to you, Quincy and Danielle, again for putting this on. I think this is a very important topic, and especially given what we're going through right now with COVID. Yeah. Given all the historical injustices that we've had to suffer, when you think about Tuskegee, Henrietta Lacks, I agree with you that the mistrust is justified. I used to work with patients who have lupus, and lupus is a disease that disproportionately affects women of color. Yeah. And back in 2011, there was a drug called belimumab that was approved by the FDA. And as the research coordinator at the time, most of the patients in the study were not even women of color. What ended up happening when the drug was approved was you're finding out that the drug doesn't even work as well in the patients who are affected by the disease, meaning women of color. So then the company then had to do a new study specifically seeking women of color who self-identify as being Black to participate in the study. So now they can have data points to know if this new drug is effective or not. So I agree with you that yes, we are doing ourselves a disservice by not participating in these studies. But I remember also reading a peer-reviewed article that not only is this affecting us with new therapies, but it's also affecting us with diagnostic tools. So this article talked about breast cancer screening. The diagnostic tool for breast cancer screening was done based on white women, but now it's being applied to all women, including Black women. And now we're finding out that those same diagnostic criteria it's not as effective at identifying breast cancer early enough in us. And so that leads to a lot of the health disparities that we end up seeing. So I guess my question to you would be, are there certain strategies you think can be employed to increase representation in clinical research so that the clinical research study participants are representative of the general population? Have you seen anything that worked with certain studies that?
So that's a great question. There are a lot of strategies I think that we can use. I mean, it starts with education. We just can't have these communities harbor this mistrust and they don't know what's at stake by not participating. And these examples that I'm hearing tonight are really glaring examples of why this is so important. I don't think that we're communicating that Also, another strategy is we have to do a better job of having relationships with communities as opposed to using communities just to recruit research subjects. We're guilty of the helicopter research method, and I call it the helicopter method, is where you swoop down into a community, ask a bunch of people to be in a study, and if they don't participate, then you leave the community and they never see you. That actually feeds the mistrust. And I've worked for institutions that had that approach, where they just, the community already turns off when they would see us, because they're like, oh, the only reason why you're here because you're trying to get us to, to pee in a cup, or you're trying to get in a vial or draw on our blood. They knew that we were there for research purposes, but that's not how you build trust. And strategies that have worked are when you go into a community and just educate them about, like, so COVID-19, for instance, go into a community and just educate them about COVID-19. Don't ask them to be in a study at all. And then because at the end of the day, we're in this profession not just to get people to be in clinical trials. We're in this profession to improve public health. And how we're getting there, obviously, is through clinical research. But, we have to be okay with just doing community education. And then communities understand that we are there to be a part of their solution. And when we talk to them about clinical trials in that vein, then we have a more listening ear. And they know that we're not just there to try to get them to sign for a trial. And another thing is we have to be okay. We have to quit measuring our success just by, getting them to enroll into a study. We need to measure our success based on how many people we were able to communicate their health situation to. And ideally they enroll, but if we spend more time establishing relationships, educating communities, then we'll notice that the enrollment will take care of itself. But we can't do it in reverse. We can't lead with, I'm trying to get you in this study. We have to lead with, we're trying to make sure that you are in charge of your own health situation and the health situation of your community. Those are some other strategies. Other strategies that I've heard that I don't know that I necessarily am that big of a fan of, because it can potentially be exploitive as well. The whole notion of, if you're going into a Black community, just get a whole bunch of Black people to go in there and recruit. So here's why that's just on the surface is not a good strategy, because Black communities can see through that too. Especially if you're an institution that's predominantly white, then all of a sudden the research team that shows up in this community, now all of a sudden it's all Black. I mean, it comes across as disingenuous. Now, what you should do is what Danielle is doing with this organization. We're trying to make the entire industry more inclusive, which it should be. And if the entire industry, we do a better job of making the entire industry more inclusive, then we don't have to cherry pick a certain group of individuals to go into a Black community. You're going to already have the representation anyway, because we've made our industry a lot more inclusive. So sorry, such a long answer.
No, that is wonderful.
Thank you so much.
This, we have, Quincy, I think we're going to have to have you come back to answer a lot of these questions, because we just don't even have the time to answer everything. But this was amazing. I feel like I've learned so much, and I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I'm going to see if we can save some of these questions and answer them in our group. Maybe have Quincy see if he can answer some of these questions, or have him back on for another meeting. But I'm speechless, Quincy. I just felt like this is just so informative. This is so needed. And you can see, like with the questions that people were asking, like they are really trying to learn more about, their health and clinical research and what they can do. And I guess what we all can do, and with having all of this information that we shared, we really want to treat people how we want to be treated. And I was just blown away about the different myths and, the history. And so I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation that we've had tonight with Quincy. And please feel free to reach out to myself. And if you're not in Black women in clinical research and would like to join, please also join. And Quincy, do you have any final words that you would like to say?
Danielle, thank you for what you're doing. I'm speechless about what you're doing and what you will continue to do for this industry. You've already made an impression on me personally and on everything that this industry stands for. So I just want to thank you for having me. I want to thank all the individuals that joined me tonight. And there's a lot of stuff you could have been doing tonight, but you wanted to have this conversation. I thank you, lastly, for choosing this industry. I think we're in the greatest industry in the world because we don't just practice medicine, we make the practice of medicine better. And I thank you for choosing this to carry out the callings and the purposes on your lives. And I've just been humbled to be a part of this event, and I'm humbled to be a part of what you're doing, Danielle.
Oh, well, thank you, Quincy. This is amazing. Thank you, everyone, so much. You guys, I'm not going to cry, Andrika. My group thinks I'm just this emotional, but yes, not going to cry. I just want to thank everyone, and thank you, Quincy, so much. And if you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to myself, Quincy. Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Well, have a good one. Thank you so much.